So our third chapter of the Elizabethans is what mattered to the Elizabethans, including their daily life. So looking at the lives of the rich, middling and poor Elizabethans, looking at family life and the problem of poverty. So starting off by looking at the gentry were the landowning people in Tudor society, the richest in society, and that title was usually describe people who did not have titles. So you can see here, this is Montacute House. This would be sort of a typical house of somebody who was gentry in Elizabethan society. It was quite medium sized really, with 20 rooms, but gentry houses could have up to 50 rooms, and the land and the house would reflect the wealth and the status of the owners. So you can see that it's symmetrical. It's got some nice glazed windows, chimneys, these curved gables on either end, and again it reflects the wealth and the status of the owners. So gentry houses would have gardens, they'd have farms, they'd be able to grow all of their own food, or they'd have people to grow it for them. They could afford various different meats that other people in society couldn't, such as beef, pork, swan, pike, which was very expensive. They would hold feasts in their homes with lots of servants, with imported wine, very expensive. They could afford to do this from other countries, and they could have banquets with dessert courses as well, so very, very wealthy. The wealth that they had came from owning the land, so the gentry made up only 2% of the population, but actually owned over 50% of the land. They didn't do any manual work. They would have people who would do it for them, but they had lots of political power. So the middling sort were people in the middle of society. They were often tradesmen, craftsmen, they owned their own businesses. They were poorer than the wealthy merchants than the gentry, but richer than the labourers who made up the majority of the population. So you can see sort of a yeoman's house that was actually in West Sussex. You can see that it's nowhere near as grand and extravagant as the gentry houses, but as we come to look at the labouring poor, it is a lot bigger and a lot sort of grander. So again, poorer than the wealthy but richer than the labourers. And there were two different types of middling sort. That we had the yeomen in the countryside, who were the wealthy farmers who had 50 plus acres of land, and the husbandmen who were sort of poorer farmers who had between 5 and 50 acres. But again, part of this middling sort rather than the labouring poor. So the houses had strong oak frames, as you can sort of see in that picture, a chimney to be able to let the smoke out from inside, glass windows which also showed their wealth, between 5 and 10 rooms, and both an upstairs and a downstairs. So this would be sort of typical middling sort house. Again, nowhere near as nice as the gentry, but as we come to look at the labouring poor, a lot bigger and nicer than theirs. Some of the rooms in the house, they would have a hall where they would have their main sort of living area and eating area. The parlour would be their sleeping room. It contained the best bed, belonging to usually the yeoman and his wife. They could often afford sort of feather mattresses, and they had lots of linen sheets and pillowcases as well that would be able to sort of dress the sleeping room. And the service room, so they might have a kitchen, a brew house, bake house, a dairy. They could have a couple of servants to prepare and cook the food, but the yeoman's wife would do a lot of the work herself when you compare that to the gentry. So again, they ate very well, but less ceremony than the gentry, so they could still afford various different meats such as beef, mutton, pork, not sort of the expensive eel, swan, pike like the gentry though. Different breads, fruits and vegetables. They didn't have luxuries such as the imported wines that the gentry had, but they could afford the beer and the mead, but their incomes wouldn't stretch as far as the wines. So the labouring poor were the poorest in Tudor society, the peasants effectively, who would do the manual labour. So that's a typical house of the labouring poor. They made up half of the population in England. It's quite difficult to find out about the daily lives when historians are researching because they don't have many written records. Only the wealthy would usually have these records. But they worked on the farms of the yeomen and the husbandmen, so the middling sorts, and they did lots of seasonal work, so they were very dependent on the weather when they were farming. So the houses are small and dark. You can see that it's sort of quite cramped. Only 2 rooms, no upstairs, just on one floor. Bare earth floor, no glass windows, no chimney to let the smoke out. It escaped through the thatch in the roof. The diet of the labouring poor was extremely limited, so bread was their main food. So we've looked at pottage when we've looked at people's health as well. So sort of a stew that contained lots of different vegetables, meat if they can afford it. When times were good, they could afford cheese, eggs, bacon or fish. They would drink beer as well. But bad harvest meant that price of bread rose, and it was very difficult to get that. So again, we're seeing a huge difference between the labouring poor and the gentry in particular. So let's have a look at the family life of the Elizabethans. So let's have a look at the relationship between husbands and wives and the dynamic in family life. So men were usually in their late 20s and women in the mid-20s when they got married. Sort of historians are quite surprised when discovered that the Elizabethans married late, just like today. They would need to save up before they could get married. A lot of sort of middling and labouring poor families, so that it would be a lot later. There was no reliable contraception, so you would think that illegitimate babies would be quite common, but they actually weren't. It was uncommon, but because sex outside marriage was forbidden. Actually, marriage did trigger pregnancy, and 30% of brides were pregnant at the wedding, which could be seen as quite surprising as well. Gentry family needed approval, so people who were getting married who were in gentry families needed approval because of the status and the money that was going to be passed down to them by their parents. So parents did have a lot of say, but the labouring and the middling families were a lot freer because they weren't getting this sort of status and power and money passed to them. Wives were expected to obey their husbands. This is the dynamic between the two. At the same time, husbands were supposed to respect their wives and seek their advice. A woman's property belonged to her husband, and divorce was extremely difficult, requiring an act of parliament. So the remarriage, you do often see that families, children were brought up by step parents. That was often when the parents remarried after a partner had died. So families were often small, largely because there's a high death rate amongst small children. So a quarter of children died before the age of 10. But the gentry did have big families. So children were expected to obey the parents. There was actually a strong emotional bond, so they did actually look after the children well and have good relationships, despite physical punishment being common, largely in school for the gentry children. So the gentry children boys went to school from the age of 7, whereas poor children were working at home and on the farms from a very, very young age. And at 13, many would become apprentices and servants, but this meant that they often moved away. So immediate family was a lot more important and common because the children scattered when they started work. So the household included the nuclear family, so it would just be the parents and the children living at home, and rather than relying on extended family, people often relied on the neighbours in the community, the people around them. So let's have a look now at the sort of final part of daily lives, which is poverty. So unemployed poor were divided into 3 categories. There's a huge problem of poverty in Elizabethan England, and they were divided into the impotent poor, the able-bodied poor and the vagabonds. So the impotent couldn't work because of a physical illness or because of their age. The able-bodied wanted to work but couldn't find the work, so there's nothing wrong with them. They were perfectly fit and healthy, but there were just no jobs available for them. And the vagabonds just refused to work. So due to a huge problem, the poor aren't just victims of bad luck or old age. There are lots of people who are in constant danger of falling into poverty, working labourers who potentially can't find jobs because of the seasonal nature of the work or because they are physically unable or refusing to actually work themselves. So vagabonds were very harshly punished. So if they were over the age of 14, they could be whipped and burned through the ear with a hot iron. If they were 18 and over and had already been caught, they could be hanged. So they were trying to avoid people avoiding work, trying to sort of introduce punishments that they could force them essentially to work. People were not allowed to give shelter to vagrants, and they could be fined. So what York decided to do was to give a poor rate, so essentially a tax to help the poor. Viewers made a list of the poor in cities and categorised them to sort of understand who was in each society. Impotent poor were given some money, so they were given 3 halfpence a day that was paid for with the poor rate. The able-bodied poor were given wool to spin in the home, so they were given something to do for work. And the vagabonds would be put in houses of correction to do work, or they were banished to outskirts or other areas. So, responding to the problem of poverty, the poverty problem was so great by the 1590s that the government were forced to take some action. They had to do something about the problem. So, what they introduced was a series of acts that came together to introduce the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601. This brought together one law, different elements. So, first of all, justices of the peace would appoint overseers. They were responsible for the poor and collected this poor rate, so this tax. Secondly, begging was forbidden, so vagrants were whipped, sent back to the parish they were born in. And finally, the impotent poor were looked after in almshouses. So these were places that were made to house poor people, and so they would look after them. Work was provided for the able-bodied poor, and there were punishments for vagabonds, for example, houses of correction. So this is where poor people were put to work in Tudor times. So this was a landmark decision. This was the first time that the national government was responding to the problem of poverty, and punishing but also helping the people who are poor in society.